While boarding the passengers on her most recent trip, Lena had an odd feeling. She had the unpleasant impression that someone familiar had just boarded the plane and couldn't shake it. While making her rounds, she caught sight of a passenger who resembled her late spouse. How is this even possible? When Lena approached him, she uncovered a secret that she hoped she hadn't discovered. Lena gasped, her heart seizing in her chest. It couldn't be real. No, 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 she found herself murmuring. This can't be true. Yet, she couldn't tear her gaze away from the end of the airplane aisle. She stared at him again. Those warm brown eyes looked identical to his. But how is this possible? No, it couldn't be. She looked again, and again. No way. She wanted to scream, but her lungs refused to cooperate. Her whole body felt numb and frozen. All she could do was stare in disbelief. She studied his familiar brown eyes, the shape of his face, his rough hands that she knew so well, hands that had held hers tenderly. This was impossible. She kept staring at the man for almost 10 minutes, but he didn't seem to notice. He was busy unpacking his bag and preparing for the flight. Meanwhile, Lena's world had turned upside down. Her mind spun. This had to be her husband. But how could it be him? And if it was him, why was he sitting here on this plane, unaware of her standing nearby? She was sure she was looking at him, yet she was equally sure that he couldn't be here. Her mind began to wander, could he have tricked everyone, even her? This chilling thought sent her reality spiraling into chaos. Just minutes earlier, her mood had been so different. She had mentally prepared herself for the upcoming flight. It was her first month back at work after that horrible day, and though it was busy, it provided a much-needed distraction. Her job as a flight attendant, and the interactions it brought, helped her feel better after the tough times she had been through since the previous year. Before boarding the plane, she took a deep breath and forced a fake smile. She had told herself that if she kept pretending to be happy, eventually her body would believe it too. So she briskly stowed away luggage and inspected overhead compartments, comfortably slipping into her familiar routine. Her colleagues chatted animatedly around her, eagerly discussing their weekend plans post-landing. She attempted to soak in their enthusiasm, hoping it would quell the uneasy feeling rumbling in her stomach. This flight signified not merely her return to work, but her re-entry into life. She needed to believe she was prepared, that the shadow of the previous year had faded enough to allow her to function again. But then, just as the plane was preparing for boarding, she spotted him. It was as though her heart had abruptly ceased to beat. Her body became a statue and a deafening silence enveloped her world. What on earth? Lena's heart hammered wildly in her chest as she gaped at the man seated at the end of the aisle. Her body froze, and all she could do was stare at the man in seat 37A. What on earth was he doing there? This couldn't be possible. Her heart raced, and she stammered, "This can't be happening. This can't be true." Suddenly, she was completely lost in the moment, forgetting everything around her. Her coworkers, the other passengers, and the preparations for boarding all faded from her mind. She could only stare at him. He had the same warm hazel eyes, the same chestnut hair, and even his mannerisms were identical. Her pulse quickened as she continued to stare. But it couldn't be real, right? This had to be some kind of cruel illusion. She stared at him again, still unable to believe it. What was happening? Was this some kind of sick prank? Every detail of his face mirrored that of his. But it couldn't be him. She knew it was impossible. Yet, there he was, sitting a couple of rows away from her. She continued to stare at him, but he didn't seem to notice her presence. Her mind was in turmoil, struggling to comprehend how Gabriel could be on this flight. The same warm brown eyes that once gazed at her with love and devotion now looked out the window without recognition. The strong, tender hands that had caressed her skin were now calmly flipping through an airplane magazine. She needed to be certain. She had to know for sure. Gathering her courage, she decided to confront him. Lena quickly grabbed the coffee cart and poured a cup of fresh, steaming coffee. Then, she took a deep breath, her heart pounding, threatening to burst from her chest. She had to know. With unsteady legs, she stood abruptly and marched towards the back of the plane. The closer she got, the better she could see him. But the impossibility of the situation made her unable to believe her eyes. "I apologize for the delay, sir," she began speaking, but her words froze in her throat. He looked up, and their eyes met. The cup slipped from her grasp, splashing coffee everywhere as it dropped to the floor. Her dress was completely ruined, but she didn't even notice. All she could do was stare at him. Lena's mind reeled, unable to comprehend how Gabriel could be on this flight, alive and well. She had been there when his coffin was lowered into the earth. She had mourned his death every day since, falling into an absolute mess. For months, she couldn't sleep, eat, or even shower properly. Yet here he sat, not even an arm's length away. The resemblance was uncanny, from the hints of gray at his temples to the fine creases branching from the corners of his eyes when he smiled. Every rational instinct told Lena that this man could not possibly be Gabriel. But her pounding heart drowned out reason, fixated on the living ghost before her. She studied every inch of his face, searching for even the slightest difference. Some imperfection in this phantom of her husband. However, her thoughts were interrupted by a loud scream that jolted her out of her paralyzed state. The man, her Gabriel, started screaming at her. "What the heck is wrong with you? Are you out of your mind?" he shouted. Lena blinked in confusion. What? Was this the way he greeted her? What was going on? Lena stood rooted to the floor. This couldn't be true. It must be a dream. But he kept screaming. "Can't you see that there's someone seated here?" he continued. He looked really angry. But how could that be possible? He shouldn't be angry at her. He had never raised his voice like this at her before. Why was he acting like he didn't know her? Lena's eyes started to water as she stared at him, frozen in her place. Suddenly, she felt a firm hand on her shoulder. It was her fellow attendant, Cassandra. "Please accept my apologies on behalf of my colleague," she said. "I'll clean this up right away." She smiled at the man and gave Lena a stern look. Finally, snapping out of her frozen state, Lena became aware of her surroundings, the people staring at her colleague Cassandra looking slightly angry, and the spilled coffee everywhere. She felt embarrassed, confused, and hurt, a whirlwind of emotions crashing over her. All she knew was that she needed to get out of there. So she quickly squeezed herself down the aisle and, without saying anything, hurried back to the galley. There, she could finally breathe again. It didn't take long before the quietness of her mind got interrupted by the loud yelling of her colleague, Cassandra. What was that? She glared angrily at Lena. "This is why I warned you not to come back to work so soon, Lena. You need rest, you're not ready to work." Lena's mind was racing. Her colleague had already warned her about not being ready to work again after Gabriel's death. She had been stubborn, insisting that she was fine and ready to return to work. But now, she had seen her late husband, or at least someone who looked exactly like him. She was so convinced, but what if it was all a lie? What if it wasn't true? Doubt and confusion clouded her mind, leaving her heart in turmoil. Lena had lost her husband, Gabriel, to a heart attack almost 6 months ago. He had been the love of her life since high school, and they had always been each other's firsts. Gabriel was the first to break her heart, but he was also the first to pick it back up again. After a while, they decided to take their relationship to another level and promised to be with each other forever. "One day, I will marry you, Lena Marie Clarkson," he had said, lovingly stroking a strand of her hair behind her ear at the high school dance. And he did. 8 years later, they got married, vowing to be there for each other until death do them part. Never in a million years would Lena have expected death to arrive so quickly. After just 10 years of marriage, Gabriel unexpectedly suffered a heart attack and passed away. It all happened so quickly that sometimes it still felt like a dream to Lena. One day, she was happily married, and the next, she was all alone, grieving the death of her husband. Lena was plunged into despair after his death. She found herself alone and without children. Refusing to accept her new reality, she practically isolated herself from the rest of the world. But as time passed, she realized she couldn't continue like this. One day, when she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the person staring back. The loss had taken its toll, turning her from a cheerful young woman into a frail, older-looking version of herself, deprived of care and love. At that point, she made the decision to return to her job and start anew. However, she had never expected that exactly 6 months after saying goodbye to her husband, this would happen. She still couldn't believe it. It brought back painful memories of losing her beloved better half, Gabriel. "Hello, can't you hear me?" Cassandra grabbed Lena's shoulders and shook her, trying to bring her back to the present and interrupt her thoughts. Lena was confused and looked at Cassandra's serious face. "What?" she asked. "He wants to talk to you," Cassandra repeated firmly. Who wants to talk to me?" Lena asked, bewildered. And then, before she even pointed her finger, Lena already knew. It was him. He wanted to talk. Lena didn't understand what was going on, but she decided to go for it. She wanted answers more than anything, and maybe now she would get them. So, she took a deep breath and steadied herself before approaching him. "Hello, Gabriel," she began, but then stumbled. Sir, I'm sorry." He looked at her, and she continued to speak, rattling off her words. "I'm sorry about the coffee. I was just so surprised to see you." He looked at her with a confused expression, and it dawned on Lena that he didn't recognize her. "Anyways," he started, "I wanted to make sure you're okay." He offered her an apologetic smile. "I was a bit harsh on you earlier and could sense that you were tense. Is everything all right?" he asked. Lena was flabbergasted. How could he possibly say that? Didn't he know who she was? Or didn't he? She felt utterly confused. From the look on his face, it was clear that he didn't know who she was and was just being polite. Was he losing his mind? Or perhaps she was the one losing her mind, and this was a complete stranger who had nothing to do with her late husband. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. Lena knew she needed to find out the truth. She needed to get away from this conversation as quickly as possible. "Thank you for your concern, sir," she replied, forcing a polite smile. "I'm all good. Is there anything else I can do for you?" "Oh no, that's all right," he smiled, then reached into his wallet. "Wait a second," he said as he handed her a white business card. "This is my business card. I'm afraid I ruined your dress." He pointed to her coffee-stained skirt. "My secretary will reimburse you. I apologize once more." "Oh, sir, that's fine. You don't have to," Lena said. "Please, I insist," he persisted. Lena didn't know what was going on, but she knew she needed to get out of there immediately. "Thank you, sir, I really appreciate it," she said, hoping to cut off the conversation quickly and walk away to the back. "Have a nice day," she added as she hurried away. Once back at the back section of the plane, Lena let out a deep breath. She looked down at her hands and noticed that they were shaking. She felt like she had seen a ghost with the face of her late husband on it. She had to talk to someone. This was the only way to make sure that she was not losing her mind. And she knew exactly who to talk to. "Cassandra?" she asked nervously. Cassandra turned her head, and the minute she saw the look on Lena's face, she knew something serious was going on. "Talk to me," she said, adopting a nurturing tone as she patted Lena's back. "Tell me I'm not crazy," Lena began, nervously locking eyes with Cassandra. Cassandra looked at her questioningly. "It's okay if it's all too much for you, Lena," she said calmly and softly. "We would all understand if you want to take a couple of extra weeks off, you know," she added. No, that's not it," Lena muttered, opening her locket. Then she took out a photograph, holding it in her hands for a moment before adding, "Doesn't he look like my late husband?" She pointed at the man in seat 37A and then opened her hands to reveal the photograph. Cassandra looked at her with great disbelief. You could tell she was thinking that Lena might be losing her mind. Her mouth fell open a little bit, and then she said, "Look, Lena, that's..." Cassandra had only begun to speak when she glanced at the wrinkled photo in Lena's hand. "Oh my gosh," she gasped, covering her mouth in shock. "That man looks just like your late husband." "How is that possible?" "That's what I'm thinking," Lena replied, quietly wondering who the man resembling her husband was. The relief washed over Lena as Cassandra's expression confirmed her recognition of the uncanny resemblance. She too had noticed. It wasn't just her imagination, that man truly looked like her late husband. But the reality remained that he couldn't be her husband. She stared at the business card in her hands, the one he had given her. It bore the name Nathan Jones in bold letters, indicating that he was the chief executive officer of a staffing and recruitment company. It was a far cry from what her Gabriel had been doing. He had always been passionate about working with people and helping them, which led him to work at a shelter for ex-convicts, assisting them in reintegrating into society as smoothly as possible. This man, Nathan Jones, was clearly not her husband. Unless, Lena thought to herself with a chuckle, he had undergone a drastic transformation and faked his own death to start an entirely new life under a new identity. The idea seemed too far-fetched, but in the midst of her confusion, it brought a moment of humor. "I don't understand," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "Did I imagine Gabriel's death somehow? Has he been out there this whole time while I mourned him?" Tears welled up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. Cassandra gently squeezed her shoulder, offering comfort. "You're overwhelmed, Lena, but there has to be a logical explanation. You need to talk to him. Maybe he knows something that can make sense of this." Before Lena could respond, Jess pushed her back up the aisle. "I will go with you," she said reassuringly. Lena was grateful for the support because she had no idea what to do. With a nervous smile, she crouched next to the mystery passenger. She stared at his face, trying to find the words, but no sound came out. All she could do was gaze at the man who was wearing her dead husband's face. "Can I help you?" he finally said after an awkwardly long silence. Cassandra sensed Lena's hesitation and stepped in. "Yes, you can help. We apologize for the intrusion, but I'm afraid you bear an uncanny resemblance to someone important to one of our flight attendants. It's quite shocking." Lena felt herself shrinking, knowing that she was that flight attendant, and he probably already noticed. She didn't want to appear shy or overwhelmed, so she mustered her courage and cleared her throat. "Do you, by any chance, know anyone by the name Gabriel Garcia?" she asked boldly. The man looked at her for a moment, and Lena thought he might say yes, but unfortunately, he didn't. "No, I'm sorry, I don't," he replied. Lena stuttered in response. "Oh, I'm so sorry. You just look identical to my late husband. I know it's likely just an improbable coincidence, but I'm grasping for explanations, to be honest." Nathan's kind eyes radiated empathy. "I can't imagine how difficult this is for you," he replied sympathetically. "I wish I could offer you more answers, but no, I've never heard the name Gabriel. This must all feel so surreal." He added, "If there is anything I can do to help, please don't hesitate to contact me." Lena appreciated his understanding, even if it didn't bring the answers she sought. The encounter left her with more questions than ever before, and the mystery surrounding the man who looked so much like her late husband deepened. The remainder of the flight was a blur for Lena. She couldn't wait to get off the plane because there was one last person she needed to visit to get answers to this mysterious matter. Upon arriving back home, Lena quickly grabbed her belongings and rushed to her car. She entered the address into her navigation and drove straight to the place she wanted to visit. There was no time to lose, she needed answers. Once she arrived at the house, she impatiently pressed the doorbell. After just a few seconds, Mrs. Garcia opened the door with open arms, inviting her in for a hug. "I'm sorry for disturbing you so late in the evening," Lena began, "but I need to talk to you about something important." She got straight to the point. Mrs. Garcia smiled warmly and reassured Lena that she was never a disturbance. "I just baked some cookies," she said with a hint of sadness, "the ones that Gabriel used to love." Lena empathized with Mrs. Garcia's pain, knowing she was still grieving her son. With difficulty, Lena cleared her throat and took a deep breath. She explained to Mrs. Garcia about the man on the flight who resembled Gabriel, showing her the business card as proof. Mrs. Garcia's eyes welled up, and Lena could see the anxiety in her expression. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Garcia?" Lena asked, squeezing her hand. "I know this is hard for you, but I needed to get some answers. I'm sorry to bother you with this." Mrs. Garcia took a deep, shaky breath and asked Lena to fetch an album from her bedside drawer. Lena did as instructed, and both of them sat down at the kitchen table. Mrs. Garcia opened the album, and Lena couldn't believe her eyes. What was going on? Tears welled up in Lena's eyes, and her body trembled as she saw two twin babies in the photos. One of them she recognized from old baby pictures of Gabriel, but the other was unfamiliar. She couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. Did Gabriel have a twin brother? Mrs. Garcia explained that the babies in the photographs were Gabriel and his twin brother. Lena was astonished but listened as Mrs. Garcia continued, revealing new information that left Lena baffled for nearly 15 minutes. Mrs. Garcia then shared a painful truth: Gabriel didn't have a father, and she had to raise him on her own. When she discovered she was having twins, she knew she couldn't manage two sons alone, so she made the heart-wrenching decision to leave one of them in an orphanage. Lena was in disbelief, but she couldn't imagine the difficult circumstances Mrs. Garcia must have faced. She felt empathy for her, understanding that she did what she believed was best for the child's future. As tears streamed down Mrs. Garcia's face, Lena felt torn between anger for the secret kept and compassion for her difficult decision. Mrs. Garcia's love for her sons was evident, even in her regretful confession. With her thoughts filled with concern for Nathan, Lena couldn't help but hope he had a better life growing up than Gabriel's childhood. Holding Nathan's business card, she observed the signs of his successful career, indicating that he had overcome any previous hardships. Lena wondered if Nathan knew he was adopted and whether he wanted to meet his biological mother and, perhaps, even her as his former sister-in-law. Lena's mind was spinning with this shocking revelation about Gabriel having a twin brother. She looked at Mrs. Garcia, who had tears streaming down her face. Lena squeezed her hand gently. "I know this must have been an impossibly difficult decision for you to make back then," Lena said softly. Mrs. Garcia nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I always wondered what happened to my other precious boy. Not a day went by that I didn't think of him and pray he was okay," Mrs. Garcia said, her voice thick with emotion. Lena's heart ached for her. She hesitated before asking, Do you think Nathan knows he was adopted?" Mrs. Garcia shook her head. "I don't know, dear. But now that we've found him, I'd like to try to reconnect, if he's open to it." Lena nodded. "I think we should reach out to him. Perhaps we could invite him over for dinner." Mrs. Garcia smiled through her tears. "That's a lovely idea. I would love to see him again and properly meet the man he's become." So Lena drafted a thoughtful email to Nathan explaining the situation. She included photos of Gabriel and details on Mrs. Garcia in hopes of stirring Nathan's curiosity. Her finger hovered over the send button for a long time before she finally clicked it. An agonizing week passed with no response. But then, an email from Nathan appeared. He shared that he was adopted and always wondered about his biological family. He would love to meet. Lena quickly called Mrs. Garcia to share the exciting news. They decided to host Nathan for dinner at Mrs. Garcia's home. She spent days preparing all kinds of delicious foods to make sure everything went perfect. Then finally the morning of the reunion dinner arrived. Lena went over to Mrs. Garcia's house early to help her get everything ready. Mrs. Garcia was a bundle of nervous energy, fluffing cushions, rearranging photo albums, and fussing over every little detail. Lena helped set out an assortment of snacks and appetizers for when Nathan arrived. She could sense Mrs. Garcia's anxiety. "It's going to be wonderful," Lena reassured, squeezing her hand. At precisely 6 p.m., the doorbell rang. Lena and Mrs. Garcia exchanged an anxious glance. This was the moment. Lena opened the door with a warm, welcoming smile. "Hello again, please come in." Nathan stepped inside tentatively and Mrs. Garcia immediately pulled him into a tight embrace. They held each other for a long moment, both crying tears of joy. Nathan clung to her, burying his face in her shoulder. The emotional reunion brought tears to Lena's eyes. Over dinner, Nathan and Mrs. Garcia talked for hours. He was hungry to learn everything about his family and upbringing. Mrs. Garcia shared stories about Gabriel and details of Nathan's early childhood before the adoption. Nathan listened intently, marveling at the uncanny ways he was similar to Gabriel. He was amazed to find parts of himself in these family stories. Lena could see Nathan's sense of belonging growing. This reunion healed a wound in all their hearts. That emotional reunion dinner marked a new beginning for their family. Nathan became a regular fixture at Mrs. Garcia's home, making up for lost time. He and Lena grew close, bonding over shared memories of Gabriel. Lena found comfort in seeing parts of her late husband live on in his twin brother. There was a hole left in all their hearts after Gabriel's passing, but Nathan's presence allowed them to heal and fill that void. Mrs. Garcia was overjoyed to reunite with the son she thought she had lost forever. Having Nathan back in her life was a blessing. He completed their family once again. Though the road that led them there was painful, Lena knew this was how it was always meant to be. Their lives were intertwined, and now they could move forward together.